Hello, welcome to the Understanding China Power webinar. This is the third event of the series. Previous events or webinars have been on Chinese investments into Europe. We had Philippe Lacour speak from the Harvard Kennedy School. Second event took place on the topic of Chinese interest, or not Chinese interest, Chinese activities or Chinese power in Xinjiang, and was mostly focused on human rights violations. We had professors from US, Sian Roberts, Darren Byler, and the scholar from Czech Republic, Ondřej Klimesh. And today we are welcoming you on the topic of understanding China's power in the EU. All these events and even today's event will be accessible on our website later. It will be recorded on the series website. And without further ado, I will introduce the topic, and after that, the speakers. Estonia's relations with China are part of a broader framework of EU-China relations, which is a rapidly evolving policy area. In March 2019, the European Commission issued a strategy paper on EU-China relations that for the first time characterized China not just as a partner, but also as an economic competitor and a systemic rival. How well is the EU and its member states equipped with the change assessment of China and its interest in the EU? First concrete steps have been taken to respond to the transformed perception of China. FDI screening mechanism is already in place, and a month ago, Commission proposed regulations to deal with market distortions caused by subsidies and upgraded EU's industrial strategy, which both are indirect jabs towards China. Chinese perception of EU and its member states undeservingly has not received equal attention, even though China seems to be past binding time with its increasingly assertive foreign policy. Does it also mean that its interest in Europe have drastically changed under current leadership? This webinar addresses EU-China relations from French, German, and Swedish perspectives in times of increasing divide and confrontation on intellectual property, market distortion, reciprocity, and access to Chinese market, condition of human rights, and so on. How successful has China been in projecting its interest into EU, and what can we expect from the future? I remind everybody to pose questions in the Q&A section after the presentations. Half of the time is dedicated to the distinguished guests' presentations, and half of it for question and answers. So without further ado, I will introduce the speakers. François Godement is a senior advisor for Asia to Institut Montaigne, Paris. He's also a non-resident senior associate of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., and an external consultant for the policy planning staff of French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Hellström is a director of Swedish Center for China Studies, where he focuses on China foreign relations and industrial policies. He has previously worked as a deputy research director at the Swedish Defense Research Agency, where he headed the Asia and the Middle East program. And last but not least, Didi-Kirsten Tatlow is a senior fellow at the Asia program at the German Council for Foreign Relations and the senior non-resident fellow at the project Synopsis. She researches, speaks, and publishes widely on political system of China, its impact on Europe, technology, and worldwide transfer, democratic security, ideology, disinformation, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Indo-Pacific. Sorry for reminding one more time, but this is an important issue. Please pose your questions in the question and answers section, not in the chat. so we can hopefully answer all the questions that you have. Without further ado, I will give the floor to François Godement, who unfortunately has to leave 20 minutes earlier. So also bear in mind, if you are addressing questions, please address Mr. Godement first. Thank you. Please, Mr. Godement, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Frank, and thank you to ICDS for giving me the opportunity to speak. I think if I came from another planet and tried to synthesize what EU-China relations are about, the first observation I would make is that they have changed a lot and they tend to move in cycles. There is almost perpetual dissatisfaction with the state of the relationship as it is. We try another model and at some point we find that it doesn't work, so there is a temptation to move back to earlier solutions. How would I explain that? When I started really looking in detail with this was about 2008, 2009. We were at the height of what I would call the illusions of Europeans and the European Commission. It was still about helping China to grow, to develop. It was largely about engaging and coming to getting China to realize what its own interests were, and its own interests had to be in accordance with ours. There was also a big philosophical and political division among European member states. We keep complaining about the EU, but in fact it has moved ahead since 2008, 2009. In those days, you really had the group of what I would call the protectionist countries. You had the group of the liberal countries, which by principle wanted no restriction, including on anti-dumping and on other related topics. You had also anti-communist and engagers. There was absolutely no agreement. And as a result, China was getting its way. We have moved over 12 years to what I would call a new realism. I don't think it means every member state agrees with each other. I don't think Mr. Orban agrees with Mr. Macron, to name those two examples. But it means they all understand that the policy with China is guided by interests primarily, especially on China's side, that there is a relations of strength and that you have to acknowledge. Now, people understand differently the relation of strength, but the EU has been able to coordinate and to create more unity. I'm not going to say they're unanimous. I'm not going to say it's easy. It'll be very easy to show cases when it's not. But if I look at what has been achieved in recent years, we have defensive commercial mechanisms which are in place. We refuse market economy status. We have improved the anti-dumping procedures. We've created investment screening, although the jury is still out because there's not a hell of a lot of public communication on how this is working. I understand that it's in fact a pretty active mechanism today, even if the Commission doesn't want to oversell it or to publicize it. We have a current study on a so-called economic coercion, which largely applies to China. It's not yet implemented or even approved, but it's under study. We have a push for a new anti-subsidy tool that would apply to third countries and end the situation when Europeans were dropping stones on their own feet and forgetting about the rest. It all is incremental. Yes, when there are high-profile issues, essentially ethical issues, which perhaps do not matter as much from a realist point of view, or people think they don't matter as much, then you can see some member states going their own ways. I cite Mr. Orban again, not because I have a focus on him or on Hungary. This is not at all the only state to have a different style of relations with China. But as far as I can tell, Mr. Orban never opposed anti-dumping procedures against China. And when recently the Europeans really got serious about sanctions about Xinjiang, he did not oppose them in camera in Brussels, even though his Minister of Foreign Affairs strutted out and pretended otherwise. Now, this is, in a very low-key and realist way, what I call progress. On the other side of the ledger, let's not kid ourselves, China is even more influential economically inside the EU than it was 10 or 15 years ago. It's our first partners on, frankly, on some areas which are the future's public goods, especially if we think about greening the economy, they could run circles around us, especially for consumer items or for big ticket public goods. We resist that for the time being, but I'm not definitely sure that when our supermarket shelves are filled of Chinese products for the consumers, I'm not sure that the taxpayer will perpetually want to resist public goods made in China when they are much cheaper and available. I'm thinking the example I talked about these days is that of road chargers for electric cars, something that's apparently very important for our future given the push towards so-called electromobility. In the whole of Europe, there are 250,000 public road chargers currently. In December 2020, in 1 month, China installed 117,000 new road chargers on the public domain, half of the entire EU stock. This is the solar panel story repeating itself. And so for those reasons, China is inescapable. That means the relationship remains complex. You were right to underline the 2019 paper, with these three. The EU has two hands, or perhaps even three, in dealing with China, and we never know which one is going to predominate. And China is trying to get rid of a third hand, and we're not terribly sure that we can deal with those three hands at the same time. That's currently the problem that's asked by some, either for ethical reasons or because of what they think is a necessary technological decoupling. But those three hands are there with different accents. I would not go too long, but use just 2 minutes to tell you that the view from China. They know public opinion has shifted. They can read the papers. They can look at the social media. They understand that they are not really attractive. They don't care. They're still pushing. Xi Jinping's philosophy, I think, was learned during the Cultural Revolution, that if you push hard enough and long enough, the human being will change. It will adapt. It's merely a question of strength and time. And so we should not kid ourselves that we're persuasive because we're persuaded. It's the problem with the sanctions currently. China escalated immediately. Okay, there are people who said it just got pretty stupid in sanctioning, four political groups, the four main political groupings inside the European Parliament. Doesn't look like a very clever step on the surface. What if they were saying you can stuff yourself with CAI, with a comprehensive agreement for investment? In the end, we didn't care so much. We can do without it because in the present situation, we will prevail. I've been studying for the past few months China's current economic situation and the views by Chinese economists. And it strikes me that they either talk about themselves, the economy, and it's sometimes pretty honestly about the contradictions, or the risks from the United States. Geopolitical risks, Biden is just as bad as Trump, or economic risks, Biden, after this giant stimulus and quant easing for the economy, may rein in finances, raise interest rates, and drain the money out of China. There are people who say he will fleece China out of its currency. Nowhere is Europe and its sanctions mentioned. So we have a big gap between what we think, what our stands are, and what we are able to do. We are on the receiving end, and this is, of course, the issue. It shows also in the triangular relationship with Russia. I used to be of the opinion that China was careful to distance itself from Russia in Europe. It was more obvious, to be frank, in northeastern Europe than in southeastern Europe, in the Balkans, or in countries like Bulgaria or Romania, but it was very true in Poland and Lithuanian state. That's no longer that much the case. It's hugging pretty close to Russia these days, in another sign that it's sort of discounting the strategic posture or strategic leverage of the EU. This is our problem, and this is why, beyond all our interrogations about democracy, all our differences of interests, because in the short term everybody has a buck to make in China, or nearly everybody, and people expect money to fall like rain from China. We have to think that no relationship with China can be approached if you don't build it as a relationship of strength. If you don't think about that first, you're likely to get nowhere and to be very disappointed. Is that the 17 or 16 plus 1 story in a resume? I'm not sure. I would be inclined to say so, but I will leave it to others to prove or disprove that point. I think I just made a small intro. I want to go further and hope that the questions will raise other issues. Thanks very much again, Frank.
Thank you, Mr. Godement, for your insight and giving an overview of the progress that has already been made in regard of China in Europe, and also the remaining issues that are here to stay, and there are no easy answers or fixes. But without further ado, give the floor to Mr. Hellström, please.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you, and thanks to ICDS for arranging this timely, relevant, and useful discussion. I agree with what François has already said, and I'd like to focus more on a specific part of Europe in my comment, being the Nordic region, and especially Sweden. Doing so, focusing on China's state priorities in the region. And I actually did this back in 2014, where it was the groundwork was made in 2013, but then I published on China's political priorities in the Nordic region. And I should say that not much has changed, or it's become more clear that the conclusions that I drew in this report still stand. It's just they've been very much underlined since. And Frank, you referred in your opening statement to the European Commission's strategic outlook on EU-China relations from 2019. And just one brief comment on the description of China as a strategic rival. The Swedish government has really refrained from using that description and instead portraying the relationship as a balance of opportunities and challenges. So, I mean, it is a challenge in itself for an export-dependent country like Sweden to balance between being a free trade Taliban and being a human rights champion, of course. But that's really where Sweden is. And so this is also what this balance of opportunities and challenge when it comes to China, that's what the government's white paper on China from 2019 also states repeatedly. It's called The Approach to Matters Relating to China. Check it out. It's been often described as a strategy, but it's more of a white paper, really. And so the main question, I guess, for this discussion is how successful has China been in projecting its interests into the EU, and in this case, Sweden, then mainly, and what can be expected in the future. And I just like to emphasize that there is a difference between rhetoric and action when it comes to, understanding Chinese behavior, and much of what I did also back in 2014. For example, there's a mantra that China does not differentiate between big and small countries. And of course, in international fora, all veto-wielding members have another weight, but the other members will have the same weight, basically. So, of course, there is some truth to it, but it's obvious from my previous research that countries like Sweden do not carry the same weight as the bigger economies in the EU. And this is something that also is reflected in China's division of countries in the EU into 16, 17 plus 1. And there was also an attempt to divide the Nordic countries into the 5+1, also, of course, involving 2 non-EU member states. And there's also been an emphasis on our early recognition of the PRC in 1950 and so on. But when it comes to this Chinese state's priorities in Sweden and Nordic as a whole, there are a number of priorities that Chinese policymakers have identified that really motivate them to observe and interact with the Nordic countries. And even though, I mean, these are small countries, they don't appear frequently on China's foreign policy agenda, there are unique competencies in these countries. And they are also, this is important, that they're open to increased engagement with China. They're very open economies. They're seen by Beijing as very easy to deal with. At least that was the case in 2014, and might have changed. And they've also become important partners to Beijing in its efforts to forge closer ties with other governments across the globe, not least with Brussels. And so if you look at the overarching priorities in the Nordic region, there are 4 main areas. And of course, the promotion of core interests is always top of the agenda. Improving perceptions of China is another interest. And then the acquisition of technology know-how is, of course, very important. And finally, using these countries as what you could refer to as sounding boards and door openers, not least into the EU. So just going into these 4 categories of interests, and you can, of course, divide these into subcategories as well. But looking at core interests, this is, of course, relating to mainly to China's political stability, meaning the Communist Party's continuing monopoly in power, national sovereignty, territorial integrity, and economic and social development. And in essence, if you look at Sweden, but also Europe more broadly, this mainly relates to safeguarding non-interference in Chinese domestic politics. But it is important to note that this priority means that the Chinese government is also ready to interfere in the domestic affairs of other countries in order to secure this interest. And you could see this, for example, cases in Denmark in 2009 relating to the Dalai Lama, and 2010 relating to the Nobel Peace Prize from Norway. And this was, of course, then understood in Beijing as interference by these 2 governments. And this led to apologies from these 2 governments as well. And you could see this, a similar development in Sweden, although there's not sort of a red line that Sweden has crossed. The Swedish government has, in fact, been quite careful with not provoking China and staying clear of the red lines that the Communist Party has drawn. But then in Sweden, there's a number of issues. Of course, the relationship right now, it has been soured, not least by the Gui Minhai case since 2015. But then there's a slew of various developments, and I think 2 that have been less reported, but reportedly, at least according to Swedish press, the Chinese embassy forced a hotel in Stockholm to deny the Taiwanese representation to celebrate the National Day. This was 2 years ago, but it also forced the United Nations Development Program to cancel an event to mark the 70th anniversary of the UN Declaration for Human Rights. And these are just 2 cases that you could point to where China's core interests come into play. Secondly, the issue of to improve perceptions of China. That was, of course, on the agenda back in 2014. It still is, but looking at the record, basically looking at how Swedish perceptions of China have decreased, have become more negative. This goal has obviously not been reached, quite the opposite. So China has failed miserably in improving perceptions, and Sweden is actually among the most negative towards China right now, if you look at public opinion. But also, I mean, back in the early years of the Xi Jinping era, when this study was carried out, officials at China's embassies in the Nordic countries were still, attempting to promote a more positive and objective image. And now, just in the recent days, we're witnessing a new campaign to promote the image of China as 可信可爱可敬, being trustworthy, adorable, and venerable. We'll see how that goes. But I think my impression would be that, or my understanding would be that, of course, China will put more emphasis on positive imaging, but in the end, the core interests will always weigh, will have more weight and have more influence than these interests to improve China's image. So then thirdly, on acquisition of technology and know-how, I participated in an effort to identify all Chinese corporate acquisitions in Sweden. This was back in 2019, published in November 2019, where we found 51 majority stakes in Chinese investments in Swedish companies and 14 minority stakes. And about half of these were relating to Made in China 2025 goals. So basically in high-tech sectors of the Swedish economy. But it's also been much about acquiring brands and access to markets and supply chains. And Volvo is, I think Volvo Cars is the perfect example here, where Geely is basically getting access to all of those. And I think this is a high priority. And I think one example of that is the fact that during the 6 years of political boycott of Norway, one of China's biggest acquisitions in Norway was actually completed. So, of course, the boycott wasn't stopped, but there was it was still possible to be pragmatic and let this deal go through. And then finally, on the issue or sort of the interest of these countries as sounding boards and door openers, of course, there are examples where you could see, well, actually, Chinese diplomats have referred to Deng Xiaoping's smaller scale, isolated experiments around China and even earlier to basically try out various policies. And you could see the free trade agreement with Iceland as one such example, but also various campaigns in the other countries. Also, I mean, this whole discussion about wolf warrior diplomacy, the Chinese embassy in Sweden was quite early up and running with this kind of rhetoric, at least. So just going forward, I think there are some issues that are bound to arise that are not, just coupled with China, but where China plays, the discussion about China plays a big role. And that's investment screening, of course, where we will have legislation in place probably towards the beginning of next year. And also when it comes to 5G, the issue of high-risk vendors, namely in Huawei in this case. But also, if you look forward, I mean, we have the issue with screening of research projects that could also come up as a topic of discussion. And the Swedish Center for China Studies will publish a study on this topic, on Swedish research collaboration with China in the coming weeks. And also, just finally, screening of companies that take part in procurement processes. I think that will be another issue that's coming up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hellström, for your interesting introduction to Chinese interest in Sweden, in Scandinavia. And I really liked how you put them into kind of categorized by the importance as core interest or overrun everything else. So Thank you very much, and I hope to address the questions and ideas you posed in the question and answer section. So I just remind everybody to already start posting questions in the section, so we would have a running start. And without further ado, I will give the floor to Madam Tatlow, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to just begin with a very brief story, if you like. In 2019, I asked a very experienced German diplomat, what did China actually want from Germany? And his answer was quite interesting to me. He said that China wanted Germany to deliver Europe to China. This is sort of, I suspect he was right. Of course, the virus hit in 2020, a lot of things changed. And at the end of 2020, we had this comprehensive agreement on investment, which was very much indeed driven by Germany and France. But it's no secret, I think, in Brussels that this was very much, very important to the heart of Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, that she wanted this done, and it got pushed through. It's, of course, subsequently had a huge pushback in some levels, in some internal society areas in Germany, but above all in the European Parliament. And I think that this sort of scenario shows, the pushback shows some of the difficulties that Germany is experiencing right now as it sort of tries to ram through a policy with China that I think, grew up over many years, but is it probably in some ways still outdated. Germany is a country that moves slowly. It legislates slowly. And I think that the comprehensive agreement on investment in some ways was an artifact of history. They began talking about it in 2013. It was, agreed on 7 years later. That's a long time. And the point being that a lot changed in those 7 years. Back in 2013 as well, China very much, I think, viewed Europe in 3 groups. And I wrote about this in a paper that I did for the German Council on Foreign Relations that published last summer. The first group, if you like, was all-weather strategic cooperative relationships, political friendships with countries in the 17+1, also Greece and Spain, for example. A second group was highly industrialized nations such as Germany, France, the UK, which was still in the EU at that point, which were to be neutralized by appealing to their strong and individual economic interest. And the third group, and this, of course, overlaps a little bit 17+1, but 17+1 then would not be in that in terms of the Baltic nations for sure. The third group was a sort of hands-off policy for politically prejudiced countries, and I'm quoting from a book by Jüris, who's a very well-known Chinese IR scholar, who's one of the few permitted to speak very much in China, permitted by the government, which tells us something about his views are tolerated, and I think do reflect a broad consensual thinking in some ways. These are mostly in Northern and Eastern Europe and would include many of the Baltic nations, also Sweden. Jakob will perhaps know this. The idea being that the growing trend of bipolarization in the international situation will impel them to give up their policies of opposing China. So this is a 2013 assessment from Jüris, which I think by and large held for a while until, we got to 2019. And as others have pointed out, the EU's assessment of China in conflicting categories, if you like. And this assessment of China as being both a partner and also a systemic rival, that's an important word, systemic, indicates that something very deep had in fact changed. And I think that China was completely unprepared for this, which reflects, I think, their own blindness, which is growing in Beijing, in my opinion, and has consistently tried to undo that assessment. Just a few days ago in China, Wang Yi, the foreign minister, met with the foreign ministers of a strange little group that went to China, Ireland, Poland, Hungary, and Serbia. And Wang Yi said, in fact, that Europeans, he praised these 4 countries as models of China-Europe cooperation, and the others should do better. It's as if, one is being talked to by a school teacher, and said that this phrase systemic rival, the rivalry bit, was irrelevant. In fact, we were all partners. So in a sense, they're just kind of ignoring it and pretending it'll go away. Now, on the other hand, for Europe, of course, there's the United States, and how are individual countries reacting there? And here, what one hears from the US, apropos Europe's systemic rivalry cooperation format, which is in any case a delicate balancing act. Well, there one hears quite bluntly that this is Janus-faced. So you face both ways, Janus-like. Now, both these opinions are, valid and interesting. Is it a contradiction which cannot be resolved, as the Janus-faced word would imply? Or is it, in fact, a very clever balancing act, which is inevitable in state-to-state relations? I think that's something that it's quite a fundamental question that needs to be hashed out. But to turn more specifically to Germany, Germany's relations with China are often described in Germany as being both broad and deep. That's the phrase is used here by officials. There are approximately 80 dialogue platforms on the official level between Germany and China. Is indeed a lot. There are government-to-government consultations. It's also quite an unusual thing. And, a lot of this is driven by Germany's own desire to export, by the strength of its certain companies in the chemicals and automotive sector. However, I'd like to say here that what I'm noticing in the last year or so, 2 years, probably 3 years, maybe even if you were to stretch it a bit, is indeed a real growing concern, even in high levels in Germany. And I think at the state of the relationship with China, that Germany has been too naive, that Germany has been too accommodating, has just kind of blundered in with blue-eyed expectations that the words of friendship really mean something. I think Germany's beginning to understand that China wants very specific things from Germany, and this is always a question: is what does China want from you? If China wants specific things like manufactured goods or financial services or capital investment, as from the US now, then there will be attempts to court countries. But I think China is very much driven by those specific needs. And one example might be the difference in the relationship between the UK and China and Germany and China now. The UK is experiencing a fair amount of very dismissive, hostile sort of words and propositions from Beijing, which Germany, despite some change here recently, has not particularly experienced. And I think one reason is that Germany's manufacturing and doing things that China wants. The UK is not so clear. It kind of moved away from having a manufacturing base quite a long time ago in many ways. So what does China want from you? That's absolutely a key question to keep in mind. I think that I think that the issue, I'll try not to speak too long because there is really a lot to say. Perhaps there'll be many questions, but I think that the issue of whether or not Europe will be able to, if you like, fence sit between the US and China. My own personal projection is that it's not going to be able to. Things are going to get much tougher. And I think that it will try to for a long time, perhaps longer than it should. But I think that the pressures are really going to grow. And if it doesn't take sort of decisive measures to sort of position itself more deeply, I think that it's going to really experience a serious sort of fraying on certain levels with the United States. For example, on the technological level, it's still possible that Europe and the US will reach agreement on technological standards, on privacy standards, on issues like that. But I don't believe that the US and China will reach that. I think that's over. And Europe had sort of better be prepared for that. That would be one other comment to make. To illustrate also this shifting territory in Germany right now toward China, and I'll wrap up with this point. I think that two points there are to make. The first is that despite these 80 formal discussion fora between Germany and China on the official level, which covers everything from, knowledge, university, medical environment, sustainable this and that. A group of very senior, very connected German politicians and businessmen in recent, last year and a half I have been setting up something called the China Bridge, die China-Brücke, and they seem to think that there's room for yet more very high level communication. Okay, I think that, they are, this is one counterforce. It's of course led by the vice president of the Bundestag, this group. It's an unofficial grouping in some ways. But I think that the counterpoint to that is something I also witnessed from a German official, where this person was challenged by a different Chinese think tanker about why the EU, with Germany's backing, passed sanctions on 4 officials in the Uyghur regions of Xinjiang for crimes against humanity and genocide. And this was seen as a bad thing of Europe to have done. And the response from this official was, well, you've been, sanctioning us for years. You have not permitted Europeans to enter China on all kinds of grounds, publicly or privately, for many years now. So if you want sanctions, this is where it all began. Lack of reciprocity, like the initial barring of individuals from Europe. We have done this, yes. Your reaction was the counter sanctions from China were excessive, really harsh. And but the reality is that this barring, this keeping out began with China. You've been keeping people out for a long time now, and you never talk about that, you never discuss that. And I was struck by how tough that kind of response was. So I think mixed picture. We've got an election coming up in Germany that will impact probably quite a lot on what happens next. So I think it merits close watching. And also I think particularly for smaller countries in Europe, such as Ireland, for example, or the Baltic states, to what extent Germany and France, as they deepen their cooperation in Europe, or say they are deepening their cooperation, will also keep their interests in mind, I think is sort of a question that they're going to need to work out amongst each other as well, that will have bearing on the relationship with China. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your insights in how Germany sees its relationship with China as one of the leading countries who helped to push through the Tsai agreement on investments, and also explaining the way China sees Germany, and not only Germany, but overall your member states, and how it likes to categorize, and to what extent these categories still are valid in today's discussions. But without further ado, let's start with the next phase of today's webinar with question and answers. I advise everybody to continue or post your questions in the question and answers section, so we can find answers to them together. And as Mr. Godement has to leave earlier, I hope everybody don't mind that I address the first questions to François. And first question, as I'm the moderator, I lose the chance to ask the first question. So what I wanted to ask is, I really liked how you pointed out the divisions inside Europe between the different political sectors of promoting more protectionism or more liberalism engagement. But to what extent do you think this liberalist thinking of engaging China through economic interaction, and also this long-lasting thinking that this greater trade and economic relations will lead to more liberal China and more democratic China. To what extent do you think there are still supporters to this thinking, as we have witnessed turn toward authoritarian rule, especially during Xi's leadership? Thank you. Sorry, you're.
Sorry, I was on mute. If I had answered 10 or 12 years ago, I would have leaned on the liberal side and thought the protectionists were fairly defensive, and I would emphasize all the what trade specialists call the offensive interests we have on the China market. Today, as Jerker pointed out, there are still people who are absolutely convinced of that, and there is also, as Didi has pointed out, in Germany, powerful vested interests to try and keep what they already have. It's not even a question of expanding, it's trying not to lose it. And I think people, for example, who are in the auto sector worry a lot about China's rise in technologies, of course, but also about China's recapture of its market and potentially kicking out foreign companies after a while. They did in, for example, the mobile phone industry already 20 years ago. Nokia was and others were casualty of that. This is, in essence, the debate that has happened around the comprehensive agreement on investment, the one that was mentioned both by Jerker and Didi, and the one that is currently in the freezer superficially because the Chinese have overreacted in their sanctions, and how can the EU Parliament approve a deal with China if it's under sanction from China? That's a bit of a guessing game, but fundamentally because there is a lot of hesitation on what it's about. If I look at the advocates, what they say is, well, we have some openings. There are far and few. They aren't claiming that there's a huge openings, but we're leveling the field towards our American competitor, what Trump obtained a year and a half ago. Phase 1 trade deal with China, which really had investment issues tucked along with the trade deal. And above all, we have what is called the binding and ratcheting commitment, which means China cannot back off, cannot deliberalize what it has already liberalized. I think that is a valid argument, at least on the surface. In practice, China finds many ways to go around it. My concern today is no longer about our offensive interests in China, because I think the path that China will take is quite clear. The dual circulation, self-reliant themes are there. Of course, when they want the money, they open up to financial interests. That's why there are financial flows to China, which hope, even as we speak, to capture individual Chinese savings. If they need the tech, they will call in partners. That's what Xi Jinping did all his life, including when he was in Zhejiang or in Shanghai. He learned to do it very early in his career, but when there's no need for it, they'll discard it. And that's the point. What I worry much more is that in the wider scheme of things, China is inescapable as a supplier, and we have to reduce our dependency to the supplier. But the liberal argument comes back because there is a cost, of course, to reducing the dependency. China often happens to be the least costly and more efficient supplier. I like to use I use the example of road chargers, but I could use the example of face masks, which are not zero technology items, as you know. They're not very high tech, but neither are they no technology items. In 2020, China exported 270 billion face masks. Per non-Chinese individual on the planet, I think it's above 45 per human being. So you can imagine how inescapable in some aspects the Chinese factory is. So I think a lot of our efforts are going to say, how do we retool our industry? How do we redirect investment to third countries? How do we try to mitigate risks? How do we try not to be naive, as I think Jerker mentioned, in handing over technologies? And he mentioned something which to me was akin to a technology export control. limiting stuff, but we're not getting rid of China either, and the Chinese know it fully well. That, I think, is the main situation. Of course, you take a country like Finland. I'm not going to take the Swedish example. I happen to know the Finnish example just slightly better. There are maybe 1,500 firms which are heavily invested in China, and a lot of them make money. They're in niches, and they absolutely don't want to discontinue the business that exists. In France, if you looked at the luxury industry or cosmetics industry, the richest man in the world is French, by the way. He makes luxury goods. He's richer than Bill Gates or the other people from Silicon Valley. So these interests exist. Should a country or a bloc's regional groupings, politics, be subservient to particular interests? I think it's dangerous because the Chinese know how to play. We have been, I mean, just before we started speaking, we were talking about themselves. We were talking about an Irish millionaire who's big in aircraft leasing, and he's now essentially in gaol in China because he fell foul of Chinese interests. These are things that happen, and we have to have our eyes open. I think it's more important than the ideological debate between liberalism or free trade, and I think the Commission is moving onwards. The only problem is, does it know how to move onwards? How do you rebuild an industrial policy when you have had none, and when you don't have the competent technocracy to, I wouldn't say run it, but shall we say guide it?
Thank you. Thank you for your elaborate answer. Do any other panelists have something they would like to chip in?
Sure, why not? I just to basically sort of a two-finger on that. I think, despite the fact that China's GDP growth is coming down, and that's basically according to policy. This is the Chinese market will still have a huge attraction for foreign companies. But that said, I think what's happened in recent years, also with Chinese competitors appearing and becoming more able to compete, more competitive in the Chinese markets, because of course there are political decisions behind the extent to which foreign companies are allowed to compete in the Chinese market. I think more companies are now perhaps not, considering exit strategies. Some are, but there is a need to diversify, an increasing need, and it's not only because it's becoming more expensive to produce specific products in China. There's also a political risk that those companies that are catering to the Chinese consumer have to relate to, and so and also, as François also I think pointed out, despite the fact that there is a promise for increased growth for many companies, not all of them have seen this. They have launched their businesses in China because there's the attraction of the possibility of growth, and those who do have growth in China, they're not necessarily making that much money after all. So I think there's an increasing understanding that China, you don't have to be in China in order to make money and to survive. But in fact, what many companies should look more into is how Chinese rivals are, improving their ability to compete, in part thanks to political decisions.
Thank you. Didi, would you like to add?
Yeah, I would. It's I completely agree, and I think that we need to be really clear in Europe that China operates very ruthless policy, I think, of technological nationalism. It's absolutely clear that it wants its own companies, its tech companies, many which have been built up from technological extraction processes around the world, all along the manufacturing chain, all along the knowledge chain, also in basic research as well as applied research and technological processes, now moving into sort of domains. It has its national champions, and it is absolutely intent that it is these companies and not Western companies that are going to dominate in the Chinese market. Now, sure, people are making money, and certain companies have, I think, recklessly invested in China, particularly German companies. And I think I'm not the only person in Germany who believes that the car industry, for example, has recklessly invested in China over the last decades because it was easy. You know, it was easy. But I agree with Jaka that I think that you don't, you know, if I was a business person in Germany, I would, knowing what I know about how the market functions in China, that the minute the legal or tariff trades are removed, then the unofficial or the non-tariff obstructions begin. And we're seeing this right now again with fashion brands, that, you know, with the intention of building this domestic circulation economy, which is one part of the bigger picture internationally. There are new moves. Just today there are reports about various fashion brands, Inditex from Spain, which is Zara, which is Bershka, which is all these companies, and, you know, boycotts starting up. Oh, the Chinese customs claims that they found, you know, poisonous materials, and this is a pattern I've observed for many, many years when I was a journalist in China from 2003 to 2017, is that the minute there's some political conflict, bang, you have some kind of trade conflict, and China discovers, you know, problems in Canadian canola oil because Canada is protesting against the taking of hostages by China. China, of course, still holds 2 Canadian hostages. You know, over the Huawei affair. So it's just a messy web of politics and business. And frankly, if I were a business person, I would say, look, it's not the only country in the world. Sure, it's a big market. World's a big place. There are more people in the world are not Chinese than are Chinese. Let's just go and invest. Let's go and invest somewhere else. Try that. Fancy that. You know, I think this is a kind of an attitude that we need to get to know a little bit better. I wanted to just very briefly mention, there was much criticism directed at Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, and he was a controversial figure, but he was also an interesting figure, I think. And I once was on a sort of a call where he was there, and I said, if you were to talk to the German car makers, VW, Daimler, and also the chemical people like BASF, Siemens, all these people, what would your advice be for them about their apparent dependence on the China market and the way that's sort of shaping, you know, having an undue influence in Germany? And really opening the back door to a heck of a lot of influence in Europe in general, of an unwanted kind. And, you know, he said, look, I would say to them, you've had it so good for so long, it's time to do something for your own country. Trying to make sure that you actually are working towards the security and well-being of your own country. And I sort of thought this was quite an interesting response. You know, the idea that maybe there's something beyond short-term economic gain. It seems like such an obvious point to make on one level, but on another level, it's not an obvious point to a lot of companies in the world, I believe. And, you know, we do have a fundamental problem with that. And that's not China's fault. That's the result of sort of capitalist economic structures and this focus on the short-term profit and shareholder value. And I think it's no coincidence that the rise of China is being met with attempts elsewhere to deal with issues such as, is shareholder value really the primacy here? Is there really nothing we can do about issues such as corruption in business and lack of transparency? You know, so I think it is challenging us to think more deeply about our own economic systems and our own assumptions and how we behave as well. And that's actually quite a useful practice. I just hope that people draw the right conclusions from it. Just absolutely finally, I realize time is tight. François must unfortunately leave a little early, but on the technology issue, you know, it's hard to express the degree to which, and I have studied this quite a bit, we've published a book about it, it's hard to express the degree to which China's economic rise since 1978 at least has been fueled by the acquisition of technology from overseas. It is enormously influential in all areas of research, of manufacturing, of all these markets where China has obtained technology, has brought it back to China, has commercialized it in an enormous range of technology transfer parks, commercialization zones, etc. You name it. It feeds right into the economy, and it comes back out. And now it's coming back out to us, in the form of powerful technology companies such as Huawei, etc. Dahua, ZTE, or Haikang, all these people. Nuke Tech is another example, of course. And again, this is something that, for a long time was actually rather under our control. We did nothing to manage this problem for a very long time of knowledge extraction from Europe by all means possible, as the phrase goes in Chinese. And I really would hope that this is an area where we start to pay far more attention to our own outflow of technology and knowledge to a country that, by its own accounts, is determined to change us.
Thank you, Didi, for your insight, and also bringing out the different cycles, how the private and public sector think and ought to think, and how exceptionally good is also China in a way, not always, but sometimes thinking in longer terms. As one might say also in retrospect that after joining the WTO, China quite, suddenly, just 2 years, created SASAC and also created centralized control over the financial sector that we can see even taking place recently with this Ant Group. So this of course gives China in a way strategic advantage. And I think one aspect of what has been seen also how China gradually became the leader of producing auto or car parts as it eased its market or access to its market. And then when it had valuable know-how, it started putting restrictions and making it more and more expensive for companies to produce the parts somewhere else. So this is something of very interesting dynamics taking shape. And also one interesting maybe thing to think about is that how we are still very blue-eyed if we think about this Tsai agreement. Why do we think that we will have any better luck with this investment agreement? So, but just a quick question also from the audience. Hellström has asked a very practical question. We have seen a pendulum swing of restrictions and free trade zones which affect business and investments. So are there some specific areas that will be easier and some areas that will see increased restrictions? And how can countries and businesses understand the complex restrictions and deal with them to mitigate risks mentioned here? As François is leaving, I will give the first chance to answer to you. Sorry, you are muted.
Sorry, can you sum up the question, please?
Yes, it's rather a question of practical nature. How can the companies mitigate the risk that are involved with, and what are the sectors that are of smaller risk in dealing with China?
The first answer is the one that Didi gave. Is VW sells 46% of its global production to China. It has a problem. H&M, which, as you know, has been, well, not exactly sanctioned, but there was a state-ordered boycott against H&M goods, but only 5% of its market is in China. So I'm sure the H&M people don't like what happened, but it's not an existential threat. That's issue number one. Issue number two is you have to remember, are you indispensable to China? Are you indispensable, or are you in competition with other local producers. If you don't have a technology edge and if you're not able to maintain it, also to keep it safe, you may run into a problem. How did the German auto industry get through in China? Well, because the Chinese didn't want to give it to Japan. Frankly, the Japanese firms were much more better equipped to deal with China than the Germans were at the time. But the Germans tend to forget it was a political decision. Same, by the way, for the fast train, for the bullet trains. Issues like that. I don't think you can protect yourself fully, because we had some of those stories, and there could be others, on how you can fall hostage. We talk about individual hostages, but companies can become hostages. I think what you do have to think is, can you use China as a production base, jump off from there? Because it's still true even today that a majority of Chinese exports are achieved by joint ventures or companies in which foreign owners are predominant. That is still true today. So China as an assembly point to sell outside is still an interesting proposition. Everybody should be aware. I'm fascinated by the Tesla story, another example of what Jürgen and Didi have given. The magical arrival of Tesla, the privilege given to Tesla, 100% ownership, big 1 billion plus investment, then relations with the Biden team sour, and suddenly Tesla cars have issues in China. And the electronics might not be safe for Chinese consumers, which is a straight reprisal for the 5G Huawei US technology denial story. So the answer is, there is no permanent protection. I think there is transient protection. One of the difficulties of KAI, by the way, will be that the investment protection chapter has not been negotiated. It's not unusual. It hasn't happened with Japan. But I would venture to say that the problems for investment protection, although they exist everywhere, including Japan, they're not as big as those that exist with China. One key issue is the arbitration, which China tends to refuse. It's clear when you look at KAI that we're moving to a kind of state-to-state, not arbitration, but negotiation over trouble for investment. That's a political tool, which is supposed to go to the highest level. But I'm afraid that the highest level, the Chinese are likely to be more obdurate and tough-minded than their European counterparts. So there is a danger there too. I can only emphasize that.
Thank you, François. Would anybody like to add, Jürgen?
Sure. Let's just add to that. I mean, there is, of course, the issue of market access, that European companies will have access to China's market when it's in China's interest, whether it's catering to Chinese consumers or if it's sourcing from China. And I guess, for example, in the H&M case, I think the main risk would be sourcing from China rather than the market. As you pointed out, François, it's a small part of the company's total revenue. But also, so there's this issue with market access, but then also, as you pointed out, the issue with companies being taken hostage. And that's also why it basically becomes impossible for companies to prepare for scenarios like these, because it's related to their governments. I mean, the fact that Lotte, the South Korean conglomerate, is not active in China, is not on the Chinese market when it comes to supermarkets. It did have nearly 100 supermarkets in China when the South Korean government decided to go with the US missile defense system THAAD, which was put on Lotte's golf court outside of Seoul, and that eventually led to Lotte Mart not having to exit the Chinese market altogether. But this was related to national security. This was basically, China said that the THAAD system was a threat to China, to China's national security, and there's no way to negotiate on those issues. And so finally, since Lotte was basically caught between the US and China, it eventually had to leave. And so I think that this issue is bound to continue, and the only thing that companies can do is basically to prepare for to decrease their activities in China.
Thank you. Next question from a colleague, Tõnis Idarand. How did Kuka's case influence perception of China in Germany? And I think Didi is more suitable.
Yeah, Kuka was the absolute wake-up call. It's a well-known example, and it was really the moment where Germany began to get a fright about what China might mean for Germany, if you like, where they began to feel threatened. The strange thing about the Kuka case is that so much activity of this very progressive robotics factory has moved to China. But the strange thing is that despite this one case taking place in the business area, which really woke people up, Germany continues to be really, really generous in how it shares of its research and skills in the robotics area, with a very, very substantial input of Chinese researchers and academics in robotics working throughout the German universities and research system. And that has not abated yet. So, in my mind, there are absolutely concerns connected to that. They are not race-based concerns. This is not a racial issue. This is an issue of the Communist Party of China, and the fact that party members and talented high-level researchers, for example, most certainly are, if you're a party member, you're subject to party discipline, and the party wants something from you. It has great leverage over you, either directly through your career or through your family or whatever it wants. So yeah, there are absolutely risks, unfortunately, to people who are from the PRC working deep within our industrial and economic systems. Now, this is a really difficult area, but I think it is one that in the interest of national security, we do have to address as carefully, sensitively and fairly as possible, but also robustly, to actually say, no, it's actually not okay, to have this continuous technological outflow, knowledge outflow to China through multiple systems and organizations and people and levels and methods and tactics and everything. And I wanted to mention, so Kuka, to reiterate, was an absolutely key moment. But I wanted to mention that, since then, trend that we're seeing very strongly is that companies that want to invest in China, overseas companies that want to manufacture in China, are being asked to move their R&D facilities to China. Now, they are not going to stay in control of the research and development that takes place in China for all kinds of reasons, not the least being China's own data security laws, for example, that anything knowledge produced in China belongs to China, etc. That's a simplification, but that's basically what it boils down to. And the current trend of what China wants to do now, after the shock of COVID and realizing that maybe people are becoming suspicious of its supply chains into the outside world, is to create this sort of dual circulation economy, which has a big domestic circulation in part. And what that's going to mean is that foreign companies that invest in China are going to come under increasing pressure to localize, because they're not going to sort of just throw out the foreign company, say, no, we're going to have a Chinese company instead. They're going to force the foreign company or oblige the foreign company or tempt the foreign company somehow to localize to the extent where it sort of becomes a Chinese company. And in this way sort of fulfills the reality and the requirements of dual circulation. So it's a sort of, it's partly a form of import substitution. It's partly a form of sort of takeover. And again, I think, Kuka was just really the warning, the early warning signal of quite a lot of changes that we're beginning to understand now, sort of 5 years later.
Thank you, Didi. Jacke, would you like to add on Chinese accusations of Swedish companies Just maybe sidetrack a little bit. I think there's a very particular case and of great interest when the CEO of Ericsson started lobbying the Swedish government for having or letting Huawei have access or like building the 5G network in Sweden. This is also very interesting dynamics how the the European companies might do the lobbying for the BRC, and it's totally understandable also from the CEO side or from Ericsson's side, as it was afraid of being sanctioned in China, as it still has quite a strong economic dependence from Chinese market.
Right, and there's also, of course, still a court case between the Swedish Telecoms Authority and Huawei that we're expecting in the coming weeks, at least, what will come out of that. And we read in the Global Times the other week also that Ericsson would be punished if Huawei lost against the Telecoms Authority, which of course is the case that has no relation whatsoever to Ericsson. Now, how Mr. Ekholm, the Ericsson CEO, has explained his contacts with the Swedish government and his basically lobbying for Huawei, and he's been trying to help Huawei out with legal expertise and so on. Is basically that Ericsson has a collaboration with Huawei in terms of R&D and also in terms of setting standards for particularly 6G, I would say. I think that's basically the motivation, the logic behind his actions. But of course, I mean, this is really in line with Beijing's interests, that not only foreign officials, but also decision makers, high-level decision makers in industry will basically speak on behalf of the Chinese government, which this basically boils down to, because I mean, maybe the Swedish market is not the highest priority for Huawei, but the fact that Ericsson is his main rival and happens to be a Swedish company, and also the possibility that the Swedish 5G decision will, can serve as a starting point for other governments and how to act on 5G and high-risk vendors. That's of course something that becomes more important to Huawei as a company and the Chinese state when it comes to getting its domestic companies out on the international market. And there are a few Chinese companies that are as international as Huawei, of course.
Thank you. Another question from the audience, Jana Vanamöller. How does China see Europe's future vis-a-vis USA and China? Do they encourage the European Union to have a third way or to be so-called buffer zone? Who would like to go first?
I'm happy to do so, if that's all right. We had a big conversation about this around the time the CAI's comprehensive investment agreement on investment, was signed at the very end of December, because it was very clear from what Beijing was saying that it viewed CAI as a way to essentially drive a wedge between Europe and the United States, which are, of course, in most parts treaty allies. So that's a big deal. And I think shows the really often rather malafide intentions coming out of Beijing now with regard to, the world order as it has been, for many years now, and its intention to change that. Why does China see that? Because China conceives of the world as being, of the world as being sort of divided into zones, of course, and so Europe is at the end of this Eurasian continental landmass. If you see the world not from Europe's point of view, but if you position yourself in Beijing, stand in Beijing and look out. You've got Southeast Asia, you've got Japan and Korea, and Taiwan, which are sort of trouble spots for China, if you like. You've got Southeast Asia, which it's very much pushing into and having a lot of influence in. You've got Laos, Cambodia, very much under Chinese influence, political and economic. You've got India is a problem for China. You've got Russia. It's making very interesting strategic defense cooperations with Russia, which I think are genuine. I don't think that they're, how should I put it, forever, but I think that they'll do for now. And I think that both countries are serious about them for now. And it's happening on many levels now. And then you've got, at the end of all of that, you get into Europe and you get into Western Europe. And so, it's a long way away. It's a small part of the world as far as China's concerned, but it's got highly developed economies. It's got a lot of technology. It's got, great tourism opportunities, etc. And, but it's part of the Eurasian landmass. And that's the point. It's very much part of the Eurasian landmass that is in Beijing, that goes through Russia, crosses through the Urals, you're into Western Europe, you're into Europe. And that's the landmass that China sees itself really driving through with trade, with all kinds of contacts, interactions, whether it's, tangible or intangible, information sphere, goods. And America is outside. So, for China, I think it's absolutely strategically crucial to win Europe over, to drive this wedge between Europe and the United States in order to sort of manage Europe in a way that is not, a problem for China as it conceives of problems. So yeah, I think this is actually one of my key objections to comprehensive agreement on investment was not the actual trade aspect of it, but that the timing of it was really pretty awful, considering that Joe Biden was just coming into power 20 days later or so. And this agreement, which was really an artifact of history, as we discussed earlier, 7 years negotiations, and suddenly they pull it out of the hat like a tired old rabbit, at the end of December, 3 weeks before Joe Biden. It's a huge political change in America that people have been looking forward to in many places in Europe for 4 years, essentially, let's be honest. Not everyone, but quite a few people. So yeah, this, again, strategically very important.
Thank you. Jacke, would you like to add?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that, I think the Chinese leadership had huge hopes for United States post-Trump. Under Biden, and expected the political agreement on the comprehensive agreement on investment, that this was a signal that the EU would side with China, and basically agreeing on combating protectionism, which is, I think, it was actually, at least at the time, a euphemism for the US, or at least the US under Trump, that the US was the protectionist power, and the EU and China could agree on that they don't like protectionism. The same with climate change or poverty or whatever issue that could come under the umbrella of the community of common destiny or future for mankind. So basically, I think they've come to realize that the US and Europe are not that far from each other after all. But there is still a possibility to divide Europe more broadly, or the European Union, and to into friends and foes. And I think that's what you're seeing.
Thank you. Human rights haven't been mentioned, so I will try to address this issue as well. With worsening of human rights conditions in China, what do you think, has EU lived up to its ambition to be the global advocate on basic rights, human rights? As it seems to me that EU has been quite soft-spoken in comparison to US. Just one example, 1 year ago, it was only Sweden who asked for sanctions on China over Hong Kong. And just recently, over a month ago, it was Hungary who single-handedly blocked the sanctions on the same topic with the argument that there are already too many issues on the table with China. So how could we increase our unity or find the common ground to really truly live up to the ambition of being a global advocate of human rights? Of course, there's this economic relations and the strong lobby groups inside our societies. Quite often, just our own business sector, who is saying that we shouldn't criticize China because we will have economic persecutions or we will face sanctions. So this is a difficult question, but I would like to hear your answer.
Can I just comment on the Swedish, since you mentioned Sweden? Yes, Sweden was alone among the EU member states on the issue of sanctions on China over Hong Kong and this national security law. But that was not the government. That was Parliament. So basically, it was the opposition that got that through, and I don't think perhaps any Swedish government would have made that decision. So it's easier to be tough on China when you're not in government. But I think to some extent Sweden doesn't really differ from other EU member states in that area. But yeah, how could we increase unity? I think that as the Winter Olympics in Beijing are approaching in February 2022, there will be debates on whether to boycott the Olympics over what's happening in Xinjiang, what's happening to the Uyghurs. And it will become clear to everyone that there is no united policy in the EU on these issues. And that's just one of many examples. But how we will increase unity, how to do that, I think Didi will have the answer to that.
Thanks for that easy easy question. Yeah, something you said actually, Jaka, made me think that the fact that Swedish Parliament, rather than the governing party, was crucial in that issue is really interesting. And this points to something even bigger. And I see this not just in Europe, but also in Canada, for example, where in fact, I think we are more or less at the point where the CCP's attempts to sort of capture business elites, political elites, those vital constituencies in democracies, which it has done very successfully over the last few decades, has really captured, it's leading to state capture, I would say. It's leading to the capture of states. And the governments are visibly afraid of doing or saying something that will, have negative blowback on their national economies or other arrangements. But what one does see is parliaments, for example, in Canada, for example, the European Parliament saying you can't expect us to pass the trade and investment agreement when you've just sanctioned all of us. That's a ludicrous situation, actually. And in other places too, in the UK as well, for example, there are large sectors of the parliament that are sort of like pushing back against the government. So we are seeing what is, I think, a kind of a very interesting democratic revival almost through parliaments, which are, of course, the voice of the people in democracies. And this real sort of upwards pressure through the political process, as it is supposed to function in a democracy, against this sort of elite capture at the top and this sort of visible hitting of interests, if you like. We see it in Canada, for example, where the administration of Justin Trudeau is very pro-China and has come under a lot of criticism from different parts of the parliament, the Canadian parliament, and committees as well, and also outside parliamentary civil society forces, to do something about the situation after China's holding 2 Canadians hostage, as Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor And so, you know, to me, it's almost like we're sort of beginning to see, and I don't want to overdo this, but I do detect something of a pattern here, that we're beginning to see a democratic pushback in the interests of, you know, the kind of life that people actually want, and a sense of dislike for this sort of dictatorship that we have in China, where we see the national governments then still very much supporting it and being part of those captured interests. I think that that's something very interesting. So I suppose what I'm saying is that, given that, Jerker, to actually come up with an answer to your handed over question, you know, maybe this is actually a way to focus on the values that are supposed to and do indeed matter within national communities, within cultural communities, is to focus on this democratic aspect, on the parliamentarian aspect, on interest building, you know, whether in Estonia or in Germany or in Sweden or in Canada, from the grassroots, at the grassroots upwards like that, saying, you know, we want this, we don't want that. And, you know, so to me, you know, we'll see, but this seems like quite a almost interesting and perhaps hopeful development, because after all, this is how democracies are supposed to function. And perhaps with its sort of elite capture verging on state capture in some places, outright state capture in some places, I would say, China is beginning to show up, you know, some of the processes that we're supposed to be engaging in more seriously, and it's challenging us to engage in them more seriously.
Thank you, Didi. This is a positive note to end the whole webinar. As you very nicely pointed out, the antidote in our own systems and right. The democratic process and structures that, but nevertheless, we should continue researching the topic, and we need to stay vigilant to avoid state capture or anything like that. Thank you again. Thank you all for listening in. Thank you for your wonderful questions. Thank you, Will, for your wonderful points made here today. If somebody was not able to listen in to the live event, this will be posted also on our website, and it's recorded. You can access it anytime, also the previous events. Thank you again, Didi. Thank you, Jerker, for your wonderful points made and insights on the EU-China relations. This is all for today. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. Thanks, everyone. Nice to see you all.